It started with a sound you're not supposed to hear out on the prairie. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't a coyote. It was thin, sharp, and human. A sound that meant something was ending. Abraham pulled his horse to a halt, the leather reins tight in his fist. He'd ridden this trail 1,000 times. It was his trail. Nothing ever happened here, until today. He swung himself out of the saddle, his boots sinking into the thick orange dust. The heat was a living thing, pressing down on him, silencing the world. But he could still hear it, a broken little whisper, begging for something. He followed the sound, his hand resting on the worn grip of the revolver at his hip, a habit he'd never managed to shake. And that's when he saw her. She was lying in the dirt, tangled in the sagebrush like a discarded doll. A young woman barely out of her teens, her dress torn and stained, dark with the one thing you never want to see, soaking into the thirsty ground. Her face was pale as bone, her eyes wide with a terror that went far beyond the physical pain. Because sticking out of her stomach was a knife. The wooden handle quivered with every shallow, ragged breath she took. Blood had dried black around the wound, a gruesome flower blooming on the fabric of her dress. Her lips trembled, forming a single desperate plea. "Don't," she whispered, her voice like cracking glass. "Don't take it out." Abraham froze. He'd seen men gutted in barroom brawls and soldiers left for dead on forgotten battlefields. He knew the gruesome logic of a blade. The knife was the only thing holding her life inside her. Pulling it out would be a death sentence. He dropped to his knees beside her, his shadow falling over her trembling body like a shroud. "Easy," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Don't try to talk." Her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, flickered open and searched his face. She was trying to figure out what kind of man he was, a savior, or just the next monster in her story. She tried to push herself away, a movement that tore a fresh gasp of pain from her throat. He placed a steady hand on her shoulder, firm but gentle. "Don't move," he commanded softly. "You'll bleed out faster." She shuddered, a terrible tremor running through her small frame. They left me," she coughed, a fleck of blood appearing at the corner of her mouth. "Said I was nothing." Abraham swallowed hard. His gaze fell to the knife again. It wasn't just any old blade. The handle was carved from dark, polished wood, almost black, and burned into the pommel was a symbol, a coiled serpent eating its own tail. His blood ran cold. He knew that symbol. He hadn't seen it in 15 years. He'd run 1,000 miles to get away from it. He'd build a new life, a quiet life, a lonely life, to make sure he never saw it again. The men who carried knives like that weren't simple settlers. They were ghosts from a past he thought he'd buried. He slipped a hand beneath her shoulders, lifting her as carefully as if she were made of spun glass. She moaned, her head rolling against his chest. She was terrifyingly light. As he rose to his feet, he saw the tracks in the dirt. Not just the deep boot prints of men in a hurry, but something else, fainter, almost lost to the wind. The tracks of a second horse, one that had been ridden away from the spot, not towards it. She hadn't been attacked by a group. She'd been with someone who rode off and left her to die. He carried her to his horse, the mare stamping nervously at the scent of blood. He swung himself up, cradling the girl against his chest. Her breath was a faint, hot puff against his shirt. He spurred the horse on, his mind racing faster than the animal's hooves. This wasn't a random act of cruelty. This was a message. This was a warning. And he had just walked right into the middle of it. He knew a place, an old abandoned cabin nestled in the hills, a place forgotten by time, left to rot after a fever took the family that built it. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. It was walls. As the weathered gray wood came into sight, the girl's body went limp. "Stay with me," he said sharply, his voice cutting through the oppressive heat. "Don't you give up now." Her eyelids fluttered. A faint sound escaped her throat. "Name?" she managed. He hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Abraham." Her lips shaped the word, a silent, breathless prayer. Then her head sagged and she was gone again, lost to the pain. He carried her inside, the dust of years rising up to greet them. He laid her on a rough cot in the corner, her breathing a shallow, rattling mess. He knelt beside her, his fingers brushing against the hilt of the knife. That symbol stared up at him, a serpent mocking him from the past. He thought he was just a rancher. He thought he'd left that life behind. But the serpent had found him, and it never let go. Just as he was about to press a makeshift bandage against the wound, he heard it. The faint, rhythmic beat of hooves on the dry earth. Not one horse. 3, maybe 4. They were coming from the east, riding hard. Abraham's hand went to his revolver, his knuckles white. He moved to the doorway, a grim silhouette against the dying light. Distant figures rode against the sun, their outlines dark and unmistakable. They weren't settlers. They were hunters. And they were coming to finish the job. The cabin seemed to groan around him, the old wood settling as if it knew what was coming. Abraham eased the door shut with his boot, the revolver now a cold, heavy weight in his hand. The riders had vanished over the ridge, but that meant nothing. Men like that didn't give up. They were wolves, and they had the scent. He turned back to the cot. The girl, he didn't even know her name, lay still, the knife handle rising and falling with each fragile breath. In the weak light filtering through the broken shutters, he saw the fine lines of exhaustion and fear etched around her eyes. She couldn't be more than 20. She looked like a bird with a broken wing, something the world had already decided wasn't worth fixing. He ripped a sleeve from his shirt, his movements precise and economical. He packed the cloth around the base of the blade, careful not to jostle it. Even that slight pressure made her groan, her eyelids fluttering. "Easy now," he whispered, the words rough with a worry he wouldn't admit to. "I've got you." Her eyes opened, just a slit of stormy gray. "Why?" The word was a cracked whisper, barely there. He didn't answer right away. He was too busy asking himself the same question. Why get involved? Why bring this trouble to his door? He could have ridden on. He could have left her for the buzzards. That's what the old him would have done. But the old him was supposed to be dead and buried. "Because no one else was here," he said finally, the answer feeling thin and inadequate even to him. She seemed to drift on that for a moment, then a single tear broke free, cutting a clean path through the grime on her cheek. Abraham stood up and scanned the cabin. He found a rusted iron kettle in a corner and took it outside to a small creek hidden behind a cluster of rocks. He moved with a predator's silence, every sense on high alert. The water was cool and clear. He filled the kettle, the weight of it a strange comfort in his hands. Back inside, he built a small fire in the hearth, the flames catching quickly on the dry, splintered wood. He set the kettle over the fire, the hiss of the heating water filling the tense silence. The girl stirred again, her voice stronger this time, laced with a chilling certainty. "They'll come back, for the map." Abraham froze. Map? What map? He knelt beside her again, placing a cool, damp rag on her forehead. "What are you talking about?" Her eyes were wide, feverish. "The map. In my boot. He didn't find it. Silas didn't find it." She was rambling, her mind clouded by pain and fear. "He said he loved me, said we'd escape together, but he wanted it all for himself." Her words were a jumbled mess, but they painted a dark and sudden picture. Silas, the second rider, the one who had left her here to die. This wasn't a gang hit. This was a betrayal. "He stabbed me," she whispered, her voice trembling, "for a piece of paper." A cold dread washed over Abraham. These weren't just gang enforcers. They were treasure hunters. And this girl was the key. He gently reached down and felt the worn leather of her right boot. Tucked deep inside, his fingers brushed against a small, rolled-up piece of oilskin. He pulled it out. It was a map, crudely drawn but detailed. It showed the very region they were in, with landmarks he recognized. A series of X's marked a path leading to a final, larger X, drawn over a cave system in the Devil's Jawbone, a notoriously treacherous part of the territory. And in the corner of the map, drawn in faded ink, was the symbol, the serpent eating its own tail. He suddenly understood. The gang hadn't just been a band of thugs. They had a treasure, a legendary stash of stolen gold rumored to have been hidden decades ago. And this girl, along with her partner Silas, had tried to steal it for themselves. Silas had double-crossed her, taken what he thought was the only map, and left her to be found by the others. He never checked her boot. This poor broken girl wasn't an innocent victim caught in the crossfire. She was a thief, a traitor to her own kind, and she had just brought a war to his doorstep. Outside, a low whistle cut through the night, a signal. They were out there communicating, getting into position. They weren't just going to ride in guns blazing. They were going to lay siege. The girl's eyes followed his gaze to the door. "You'll fight them," she stated, not a question. "They are cruel. They don't stop." Abraham looked down at the map in his hand, then at the girl on the cot. He had a choice to make. He could give them the map. He could give them the girl. He could walk away and go back to his quiet, empty life. It was the smart play, the safe play. He tucked the map into his own pocket. He picked up his revolver, the metal cool and familiar against his palm. "Then neither will I," he said. Something in his voice, something flat and final, seemed to calm her. She let her eyes close, her breathing a little steadier. He watched her for a long moment, the firelight casting dancing shadows on her face. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story, not the real one. All he knew was that she was bleeding out on a dirty cot in a forgotten cabin, and a pack of wolves was circling outside, and he had just chosen her side. He spent the night in a chair by the door, the revolver across his lap. He dozed but never slept, his mind alert to every creak of the old cabin, every rustle in the grass outside. Twice he heard what sounded like a man moving stealthily in the dark, just beyond the tree line. They were testing him, probing his defenses. Just before dawn, the girl, Lily, she'd whispered in a fever dream, stirred. Her hand, weak but insistent, found his. "Why?" she asked again, her voice clear this time, the fever having broken for a moment. "Why risk everything for a thief?" Abraham looked down at their joined hands, his calloused and scarred from a life of hard labor and harder fights, hers small and delicate, yet stained with the grime of a life he could only imagine. "Maybe I'm not doing it for the thief," he said, his voice low and rough. "Maybe I'm doing it for the girl they left to die in the dirt." A sound cut through the pre-dawn stillness. The sharp, unmistakable crack of a twig snapping under a heavy boot. It was close. Too close. Abraham was on his feet in an instant, the revolver in his hand before the echo faded. Lily's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. "They're back." He didn't need to answer. He moved to the door, every muscle coiled and ready. This was it. The game was over. He looked back at her face a pale oval in the gloom. In her eyes he saw fear, yes, but he also saw something else, something he hadn't seen before, a flicker of trust. "Don't let them take me," she whispered, the words of prayer. Abraham paused at the door, his shadow long and dark in the dying firelight. He gave her a grim, determined smile. "Over my dead body." The whistle sliced through the dawn, sharp and mocking. Abraham didn't flinch. He was already outside, using the gray pre-dawn light as cover. The cabin door was shut behind him. He wasn't going to let this fight happen in there. Not with her. 3 riders crested the nearby ridge, their forms like dark cutouts against the pale emerging sun. They moved with a lazy confidence, the arrogance of predators who believe their prey is already cornered. The man in the lead had a nasty scar that snaked down his cheek, disappearing into his collar. He reined in his horse a few yards from Abraham and spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Well, well," the scarred man drawled, his voice grating. "Look what we have here. The ghost of the prairie, playing nursemaid to our little traitor." He smirked. "You've got something that belongs to us, old man. 2 things, in fact." Abraham stood his ground, revolver held loosely at his side, pointing at the dirt. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were chips of ice. "She's not yours, and the map is mine." The other 2 men chuckled, a low, ugly sound. "Is that so?" the scarred man continued. "That girl, Lily, she made a pact, broke bread with us. Then she and that snake Silas decided to take what wasn't theirs. Silas paid his price. Now it's her turn." So they'd already caught up to Silas. That explained why they were so certain she had the map. Abraham's mind worked quickly. Silas was dead, which meant these men were ruthless, but it also meant their numbers were smaller than they could have been. You've been hiding out here for years, Abraham, the scarred man said, and the use of his name sent another jolt through him. They knew who he was. This wasn't a random encounter. We all heard the stories, the enforcer for the Serpent Gang, the man who walked away from a fortune, vanished into thin air. Did you really think you could just disappear? The serpent always finds its own. The pieces clicked into place with sickening finality. They weren't just here for Lily and the map. They were here for him. This was a homecoming. Turn around and ride away, Abraham said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. That's your only warning. The scarred man laughed, a harsh, barking sound. You warn us? You're one man, Abraham. An old man. We are three. The math ain't on your side. The hammer of Abraham's revolver clicked back. The sound was unnaturally loud in the still morning air, a sharp, definitive punctuation mark. Try me. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. The riders exchanged uneasy glances. They had expected a broken-down hermit, not the cold-blooded killer from the stories. The scarred man's sneer faltered for just a second. Then all hell broke loose. The man on the right went for his rifle. He was fast, but Abraham was faster. The revolver bucked in his hand, the shot echoing across the plains. The rider jerked, a look of pure surprise on his face, before toppling sideways from his saddle. The other two opened fire simultaneously. Bullets tore through the air, whizzing past Abraham's head and thudding into the cabin wall behind him. He dove, rolling behind a small rocky outcropping as splinters exploded from the wood where he'd just been standing. Inside, he heard Lily cry out in terror. He came up on one knee, sighted down the barrel, and fired again. The second rider clutched his chest, his rifle clattering to the ground. He stayed in the saddle for a long, surreal moment before slumping forward over his horse's neck. The horse panicked, bolted, and galloped away into the rising sun. Now it was just him and the scarred man. "You bastard!" the man screamed, his face a mask of fury. He swung his own pistol around, firing wildly. Abraham felt a searing, white-hot pain rip through his left shoulder. The impact spun him around, and he fell hard, his revolver skittering away in the dust. He was hit, and he was disarmed. The scarred man dismounted, a triumphant, cruel grin spreading across his face. He walked slowly towards Abraham, reloading his pistol with deliberate movements. "I told you, old man. The math was never on your side. You should have stayed gone. Should have stayed a ghost." Abraham pushed himself up, his left arm useless, blood soaking his shirt. He looked at the man advancing on him, the man who represented everything he had tried to escape. The violence, the greed, the past. "You think this is over?" Abraham grunted, his voice tight with pain. "It was over the moment you decided to play the hero," the scarred man sneered, raising his pistol. "Any last words, enforcer?" Abraham just stared at him, not with fear, but with a strange, unnerving calm. "Just one," he said. "What's that?" "Duck." The scarred man frowned in confusion, and in that split second of hesitation, the cabin door flew open. Lily stood there, framed in the doorway. She was pale, shaking, and holding the heavy rifle she'd taken from one of the dead men. Her eyes were filled with a terrifying resolve. She wasn't a victim anymore. She wasn't a thief. She was a survivor. She pulled the trigger. The rifle's blast was deafening. The scarred man was thrown backward as if punched by an invisible giant, a dark hole appearing in the center of his chest. He hit the ground and didn't move. Silence descended, broken only by the cawing of a distant crow and the ragged sound of Abraham's own breathing. He looked from the dead man to the girl in the doorway. She was still holding the rifle, her knuckles white, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and triumph. Then the rifle slipped from her fingers and she collapsed. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the fire in his shoulder, and rushed to her side. He gathered her up and carried her back inside, laying her gently on the cot. Her wound had opened up again from the exertion, and fresh blood was seeping through the makeshift bandage. "You saved my life," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. She looked up at him, her stormy eyes searching his. "You saved mine first." He worked quickly, tearing more strips from his ruined shirt to bind his own wound, then hers. They were a mess. Both bleeding, both exhausted, surrounded by death. But they were alive. As he was tightening the bandage around her waist, his fingers brushed against something hard tucked into the lining of her dress. It wasn't part of the corset. It was a small, flat object. He carefully worked it free. It was a tarnished silver locket. He popped it open. On one side was a miniature portrait of a stern-looking man and woman. On the other side, nestled behind the portrait, was not another picture, but a tiny folded piece of paper. It was brittle with age. He carefully unfolded it. It was a deed to a huge parcel of land, the very land the cabin was on, the land his ranch was on, the land he had bought for a pittance years ago from the state, believing it to be abandoned. The deed was made out to a Mr. and Mrs. Alistair Finch, and their sole heir, a daughter named Lillian Finch. He stared at the name. Lillian. Lily. He looked from the deed to the girl on the cot. Her eyes were closed, her face pale and peaceful in the morning light. She wasn't a thief named Lily who had joined a gang. She was Lillian Finch, the rightful owner of everything he had, the girl whose parents had been struck down by a fever in this very cabin, leaving their infant daughter to be taken by the state and lost to the system that had spat her out and into the hands of the Serpent Gang. He hadn't saved a stranger. He had saved the girl whose life he had unknowingly stolen. The silence in the cabin was suddenly heavier than any gunshot. Abraham stared at the deed, the delicate looping script, a testament to a life that had been violently derailed. Lillian Finch. It felt like a ghost name. He looked at the girl on the cot, really looked at her. He saw it now, beneath the dirt and the pain, the fine bone structure, the stubborn set of her jaw. It was the face of the woman in the locket. This wasn't just a hideout. This was her home. She had been brought here not by chance, but by some cruel, twisting thread of fate. The map wasn't the real prize. It never was. The gold was just a convenient lie, a story the gang had told themselves. The real treasure was this land, rich with water, fertile, worth a fortune to the right person. The Serpent Gang hadn't just stumbled upon it. They had known. They had been trying to find the lost heir, the key to unlocking a legal claim to this entire valley. And Silas hadn't just betrayed Lily for a share of some mythical gold. He had likely discovered the truth about who she was. He had stabbed her and left her for dead, planning to use the deed to claim the land for himself. The other gang members weren't just his partners, they were his competition. Abraham felt the floor drop out from under him. He had built his entire life, his entire redemption, on this patch of earth. He had worked it, bled for it, made it his sanctuary from the world. And it was all built on a lie. It was all hers. He sank down onto the stool beside her, the deed trembling in his hand. What was he supposed to do? Tell her? Awaken this girl from a nightmare only to tell her that the one person who had helped her was the man living on her stolen inheritance? The irony was so bitter it tasted like poison. He looked at his own wound, a dull, throbbing ache in his shoulder. He looked at the bodies outside, already beginning to draw flies in the morning heat. He had killed 3 men to protect her. But what had he really been protecting? Her, or his own stolen peace? Hours passed. He cleaned himself up as best he could, his movements slow and painful. He dragged the bodies away from the cabin, a grim and necessary task. He found their horses, loaded them with the men's supplies, and set them free, slapping their rumps to send them galloping away. He would not profit from this day's work. When he came back inside, Lily was awake. Her eyes were clear, the fever gone, replaced by a quiet, watchful intelligence. "They're gone?" she asked, her voice weak but steady. "They're gone," he confirmed. He couldn't meet her eyes. He busied himself at the hearth, adding wood to the fire, his back to her. "You're a good man, Abraham," she said softly. The words were like a physical blow. He flinched, his shoulders tensing. "No," he said, his voice rough. "I'm not. You saved me. You fought for me. That's more than anyone has ever done." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was filled with a fragile hope. "When I'm better, maybe I can work for you. On your ranch. I'm a hard worker. I can earn my keep." He finally turned to face her. The locket and the deed were on the small table beside him. He picked them up and walked over to the cot. He held them out to her, his hands steady despite the tremor he felt deep inside. "You don't have to earn your keep," he said, his voice raw. "It's already yours." She looked at him, confused, then down at the items in his hand. She took the locket first, her fingers tracing the familiar silver curves. A flicker of recognition, of a memory so deep it was almost lost, crossed her face. Then she took the deed. She unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning the words. She read it once, then twice. Her breath hitched. Her gaze shot from the paper to his face, her stormy eyes wide with disbelief and a dawning, terrible understanding. "Finch," she whispered, the name an unfamiliar sound on her tongue. "Lillian Finch." "It's you," he said quietly. "This is your land. This cabin, it was your home." The truth hung between them, stark and undeniable. She wasn't a charity case he had rescued. She was a dispossessed heir, and he was the squatter, the man who had unknowingly benefited from her tragedy. Tears welled in her eyes, but they weren't tears of joy. They were tears of confusion, of a world that had just been turned upside down for the second time in as many days. "So what now?" she whispered, clutching the deed to her chest like a shield. "Are you going to leave?" He looked around the small, dusty cabin. He looked at her, so small and broken on that cot. He thought of his ranch, the quiet solitude, the life he had so carefully constructed. It was all built on her loss. He could walk away. He could give it all back to her and disappear again, become a ghost once more. It would be the honorable thing to do, the right thing. But as he looked at her, at the raw courage and the stubborn will to live that shone in her eyes, he realized he couldn't leave. Not because of the land, not because of the ranch, but because of her. "No," he said, his voice firm. "I'm not going to leave." He knelt beside the cot so their eyes were level. "This is your land, Lillian. That's the truth. And you can do with it whatever you want. You can tell me to go, and I'll be gone by sunset. But there's another truth. There are still men out there. The rest of the Serpent Gang. They know about the deed now. They know who you are. They won't stop coming. Not ever." He reached out, his calloused hand gently taking hers. "You need a protector, and I owe you a debt." She stared at him, the weight of his words settling over her. He wasn't just offering to stay, he was offering a partnership, a dangerous, uncertain alliance against the ghosts of both their pasts. "So what are you proposing?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I propose we fight them," he said, a grim smile touching his lips. "Together, we fortify this place. We use their greed against them. We turn your home into their tomb. And when it's all over, the land is yours, free and clear." It was a crazy plan, a suicide mission. But as she looked into his steady, determined eyes, she saw something she hadn't seen in a very long time. A chance. She squeezed his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Okay, Abraham," she said, a flicker of the old fire returning to her gaze. "Let's go to war." The days that followed were a blur of pain, planning, and preparation. Abraham was a man transformed. The quiet, solitary rancher was gone, replaced by the ruthlessly efficient enforcer he once was. He moved with a sense of purpose that was both terrifying and reassuring. His shoulder wound was bad, but he ignored it, his focus entirely on their survival. He taught Lily how to clean, load, and fire every weapon he owned. He showed her how to track, how to listen to the whispers of the wind, how to read the signs the prairie offered up to those who knew its language. She was a quick study, her mind sharp and her hands steady. The fear was still there, a constant shadow in her eyes, but it was now tempered with a cold, hard resolve. They turned the cabin into a fortress. He boarded up the windows, leaving only small, strategic slits for shooting. He dug trenches around the perimeter, using the rocky terrain to his advantage. He set traps, simple but brutal things made of rope, sharpened stakes, and a deep understanding of human carelessness. As they worked, they talked. He told her about his life in the gang, the violence that had eventually sickened him, the night he walked away after a job went too far. He didn't spare himself the ugly details. He wanted her to know exactly who he was, the good and the bad. She, in turn, told him of her life, of the cold, impersonal orphanage, of running away as a teenager, of falling in with Silas, who had promised her adventure and love, but had given her only betrayal. They were two broken pieces of the same violent world, finding a strange sort of solace in each other's scars. One evening, as they sat by the fire cleaning their rifles, she looked at him, her expression serious. "What happens after, Abraham?" she asked quietly. "If we live through this, what happens then?" He stopped what he was doing and met her gaze. "I told you, the land is yours. I'll move on. And if I ask you to stay?" The question hung in the air between them, more potent than gunpowder. He didn't have an answer. For 15 years, his only goal had been to be alone, to atone in solitude. But the thought of leaving her now, of walking away from the strange, dangerous bond they had forged, left an ache in his chest that had nothing to do with his wound. Before he could reply, a sound from outside sent them both reaching for their weapons. It was the frantic whinny of a horse, followed by a single gunshot that echoed in the night. They peered through one of the firing slits. In the pale moonlight, they could see a lone figure stumbling towards the cabin. It was a man clutching his side, leaving a dark trail in the dust behind him. "It's a trap," Lily whispered, her rifle already aimed. "Wait," Abraham said, his eyes narrowed. He recognized the man. It was Jed, one of the lower-level members of the Serpent Gang, a man known more for his mouth than his muscle. Jed collapsed just yards from their front trench. "Abraham!" he croaked, his voice raw with pain. "Help me! He's gone crazy!" "Who's gone crazy?" Abraham shouted back, his voice hard. "The ghost!" Jed cried out. "He's here! He found us! He's killing everyone!" Abraham felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. The ghost, the legendary, almost mythical leader of the Serpent Gang. A man so ruthless and so secretive that most of the gang members had never even seen his face. He was the one who had given the orders, the one who had orchestrated the massacre that made Abraham leave. Abraham had always assumed the ghost was a story, a bogeyman created to keep the grunts in line. But Jed was dying, and dying men didn't lie about bogeymen. "He found out about the deed," Jed gasped, coughing up blood. "He knows who she is. He's not here for the land, Abraham. He's here to tie up loose ends, to erase the past. He's—" Jed's words were cut short by a second gunshot, this one coming from the darkness of the ridge. The shot was impossibly accurate. Jed's body jerked and then lay still. A new voice, cold and calm, floated down from the ridge. It was a voice that oozed a chilling, confident authority. "Hello, Abraham. It's been a long time. I see you found my missing property." Abraham's blood turned to ice. He knew that voice. He had only heard it once, 15 years ago, on the night of the massacre. The night he ran. He looked over at Lily. Her face was a mask of terror. This wasn't just a gang of thugs anymore. This was something else entirely. This was the serpent's head. "Get down!" Abraham hissed, pulling her away from the wall. Seconds later, a volley of gunfire erupted from the ridge, tearing through the cabin walls. Splinters flew like shrapnel. They were pinned down, outgunned, and their enemy was a ghost who knew Abraham by name. The carefully built fortress suddenly felt like a coffin. The ghost wasn't just a legend. He was real, and he had come to bury them both. The barrage was relentless. Bullets chewed through the old wood of the cabin, shredding their defenses, turning their sanctuary into a death trap. Abraham and Lily huddled behind an overturned heavy oak table, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and splintered pine. "He's trying to flush us out," Abraham yelled over the din. "Keep your head down." The shooting stopped as suddenly as it began. An eerie silence fell, broken only by the ringing in their ears. "You can't hide in there forever, Abraham," the voice of the ghost called out, closer this time. He was moving, circling them. "You always were a coward. You ran from me once. You can't run again. Give me the girl and I will grant you the clean death you should have had 15 years ago." "Who is he?" Lily whispered, her voice trembling. "He's the man who created the Serpent Gang," Abraham said, his jaw tight. "The man who pulls the strings. I never saw his face. Nobody did. He was always just a voice in the dark, giving orders. He knows you. He knows I'm the only one who ever defied him, the only one who walked away." Another long silence stretched. They were playing a waiting game, a game of nerves. Abraham knew the ghost was a master strategist. He wouldn't just charge in. He would dissect their position, find a weakness, and exploit it with brutal efficiency. Then came a new sound, a low, scraping noise from the back of the cabin. "He's trying to get in through the back," Abraham breathed. He motioned for Lily to stay put, his revolver held tight in his good hand. He crept silently towards the rear wall, his boots making no sound on the dusty floorboards. He pressed his ear against the wood. He could hear faint whispers. It wasn't just the ghost. He had men with him. Abraham looked around desperately. Their carefully laid traps were all at the front. They were exposed from the rear. He saw the hearth, the dying embers of the fire still glowing. An idea, desperate and dangerous, sparked in his mind. He grabbed the rusted iron kettle, now filled with lamp oil for their lanterns. He moved back to Lily. "When I give the signal," he whispered, his eyes boring into hers, "you open fire on the front door. Don't stop shooting until your rifle is empty. Understand?" She nodded, her face pale but determined. He moved to the rear wall, positioning himself beside the small, boarded-up window. He could hear them working on the logs, prying them apart. He uncorked the kettle of oil and waited, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He could hear a man grunt with effort, and then the sound of a log giving way. A sliver of moonlight pierced the darkness. "Now, Lily!" he roared. The rifle erupted, its deafening blasts echoing the chaos from before. At the front of the cabin, dirt kicked up as Lily's bullets peppered the ground near the door, creating the perfect diversion. At the back, the men were startled by the sudden noise. A face appeared in the new opening, and in that instant, Abraham acted. He threw the contents of the kettle through the gap, dousing the men outside with flammable oil. Before they could react, he pulled a burning stick from the hearth and tossed it after the oil. The world outside the back wall exploded into an inferno. Screams of agony ripped through the night as men were engulfed in flames. The smell of burning flesh filled the air. But the ghost's voice cut through the horror, icy and unfazed. "Impressive, Abraham, but you've just used up your last trick." Suddenly, the roof above them groaned. A heavy thud, then another. They were on the roof. "He's going to burn us out," Abraham realized. He looked at Lily, at the grime on her face, and the fire reflected in her eyes. There was no way out. They were trapped. "I'm sorry, Lily," he said, his voice raw. "I led you into this." She shook her head, her hand finding his in the dark. "No. You gave me a chance to fight. I'd rather die here, fighting with you, than in the dirt alone." A piece of the roof near the chimney, already weak from age, suddenly crashed inwards. A figure dropped through the opening, landing in a low crouch on the floor, silhouetted against the flames from outside. He was dressed in black, his face obscured by shadows. The ghost. He held a pistol in each hand, both aimed directly at them. "The end of the line," the ghost said, his voice no longer a disembodied sound, but the immediate, terrifying presence of their executioner. But as he stepped forward, out of the shadows and into the flickering firelight, Abraham's blood ran cold. It wasn't the guns that shocked him. It was the face. A face he knew. A face he hadn't seen in 20 years. A face he had last seen in a dusty town square, wearing a sheriff's badge. The ghost was Sheriff Miller, the respected lawman from the nearest town, the man who was supposed to uphold the law, the man people trusted with their lives. "Miller," Abraham breathed, his mind reeling. Sheriff Miller smiled, a cold, dead thing. "Surprised, Abraham? Who better to run a criminal empire than the man in charge of stopping it? It's the perfect cover. I get a cut of every score, and I make sure my investigations never lead anywhere. But you were a loose end. And this girl," he glanced at Lily, "she's a threat to my retirement." He explained it all with a chilling detachment. He had orchestrated the fever that killed Lily's parents, hoping to seize the land through legal loopholes. When that failed and Lily was sent away, he formed the Serpent Gang to hunt for her, using the cover story of a lost treasure to motivate his men. He was the serpent's head and the law's arm, playing both sides for decades. "Now," Miller said, raising his pistols, "the deed, and then you both die." Abraham looked at Lily. He saw the last of her hope draining away. They had fought so hard only to be cornered by the most powerful man in the territory. But Abraham wasn't the same man who had run away 15 years ago. He had something to fight for now. He pushed Lily behind him, shielding her with his body. "You'll have to kill me first, Miller," he said, raising his own revolver. "That was always the plan," Miller sneered. 3 guns were aimed. 3 fingers were tightening on their triggers. The air crackled with the certainty of death. But before any of them could fire, another section of the burning roof gave way. A massive, flaming beam crashed down directly between them, showering the room with sparks and embers. It wasn't a rampart. It was a wall of fire, separating them from their executioner. They were saved for a moment, but they were also trapped in a burning, collapsing building with no way out. The heat was immense, the smoke thick and choking. "There's no escape, Abraham," Miller's voice taunted from the other side of the flames. "Die for her. It's a fitting end for a traitor." Abraham grabbed Lily's hand, pulling her towards the floorboards at the center of the room. "The old cellar," he choked out, remembering the stories of the original family. "They had a storm cellar under the floor." He stomped on the boards, searching for a weak spot, a hollow sound. The smoke was blinding him, searing his lungs. The roar of the fire was deafening. He saw a faint outline under the dust, a trap door he had never noticed before. He heaved at it, his wounded shoulder screaming in protest. It wouldn't budge. Lily joined him, adding her strength to his. Together they gave one last, desperate pull. With a groan of rusted hinges, the trapdoor flew open, revealing a dark, musty-smelling hole. "Go!" he yelled, pushing her towards the opening. She scrambled down the rickety ladder into the darkness below. Abraham turned for one last look. Through the wall of fire, he could see Miller's silhouette, a demon wreathed in flame. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, a final hateful acknowledgement. Then Abraham dropped down into the cellar, pulling the heavy door shut just as the main roof of the cabin collapsed above them, plunging them into absolute darkness and the deafening roar of their world ending. The darkness in the cellar was total and suffocating. Above them, the world roared and cracked, the fire consuming the last remnants of the cabin, of Lily's home. The trap door above them grew hot to the touch, the air thick with the smell of smoke and finality. They were alive, but they were buried. Lily was coughing, her body racked with tremors. Abraham found her in the dark, his hands surprisingly gentle as he guided her to a corner, away from the heat of the door. "We're alive," he whispered, the words scratching his raw throat. "For how long?" she whispered back, her voice laced with despair. "We're trapped. We'll run out of air." He didn't have an answer for that. He could only offer the silent comfort of his presence, a steady rock in the terrifying darkness. Time ceased to have meaning. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. They sat in silence, listening to the fire die down, replaced by the ominous creaking of cooling, charred timbers. Finally, after an eternity, Abraham stood up. "Stay here," he said. He felt his way to the ladder and pushed against the trapdoor. It was incredibly heavy, covered in debris. He pushed again, every muscle in his body straining, the pain in his shoulder a distant, throbbing drumbeat. With a final agonized groan, the door shifted. A sliver of gray light cut through the darkness. The air that rushed in was cool and clean, tasting of dawn and dew. It was the most beautiful thing Abraham had ever experienced. He pushed the door open the rest of the way and climbed out. The sight that greeted him stopped his breath. Where the cabin had stood was now a blackened, smoking ruin. The only things left standing were the stone hearth and chimney, a grim tombstone marking the grave of Lily's past. The world was washed in the soft, pale colors of a new day. Of Miller and his men, there was no sign. They were either dead in the fire or long gone, believing their work was done. He helped Lily out of the cellar. She stared at the wreckage, her face streaked with soot and tears. Everything was gone. The locket, the deed, the last physical traces of her family, all turned to ash. She swayed on her feet, and he caught her, holding her steady. She sagged against him, her fight finally exhausted. "It's all gone," she wept into his chest. "I have nothing." He held her tight, his chin resting on the top of her head. "That's not true," he said softly. "You have your life, and you have the land." He looked out at the vast rolling prairie, bathed in the golden light of sunrise. "Ashes can be cleared away. New things can be built." He paused, his heart pounding. "And you have me, if you'll have me." She pulled back, looking up at him, her stormy eyes searching his. The horrors of the night were still there, but beneath them, a new light was dawning. "After all this," she asked, "you still want to stay?" "Lillian Finch," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that was bigger than gratitude, bigger than debt. "Staying with you is the only thing that makes any sense." The unspoken words hung between them, more powerful than any declaration. It wasn't about ownership or protection anymore. It was about two souls who had been forged into something new in the crucible of violence and fire. But their story wasn't over. They both knew Miller was still out there. The ghost. A respected sheriff who was also a monster. Who would believe them? It was their word. The word of a former outlaw and a girl everyone thought was a common thief, against a decorated lawman. They were still fugitives. A few days later, they were making their way towards Abraham's ranch. Her ranch, when they saw the dust cloud in the distance. A posse, riding hard. "It's him," Lily said, her hand instinctively going for the pistol at her hip. "No," Abraham said, his eyes narrowed. "That's not Miller's style. That's a federal marshal's posse." They stood their ground as the riders approached. A grim-faced man with a silver star on his chest reined in his horse in front of them. "You Abraham?" the marshal asked, his eyes taking in their ragged appearance, their weapons, the haunted look in their eyes. "I am," Abraham said. "And you must be Lillian Finch," the marshal said, tipping his hat to Lily. "We found a man a few miles from here. Name was Jed. Barely alive, but he told us one hell of a story before he died. A story about a sheriff, a gang, and a stolen inheritance." It turned out Jed had survived. He had crawled away from the initial firefight and, in a final act of defiance against the man who had used him and left him for dead, he had found the law. His dying confession corroborated every impossible detail of their story. The marshal looked from Abraham to Lily. "Sheriff Miller has been arrested. He's talking, naming every member of the Serpent Gang, trying to save his own skin. It's over. You're both free." The words took a moment to sink in. Free. It was a concept neither of them had truly understood before. "The United States government thanks you," the marshal continued. "And as a token of that gratitude and in light of the circumstances, the original deed to this land has been fully and legally restored to you, Miss Finch. Uncontested." He handed her a new official-looking document. Lily took it, her hands trembling. It was finally truly over. As the posse rode away, leaving them in the quiet stillness of the prairie, Lily looked at Abraham. The land was hers. The past was behind her. The future was a wide-open, unknown country. "So," she said, a small, tentative smile playing on her lips, "I own a ranch now, but I don't know the first thing about running one." Abraham returned her smile, the expression reaching his eyes for the first time in 15 years, chasing away the last of the ghosts. "Good thing you've got a foreman who does," he said. He reached out and gently brushed a stray piece of ash from her cheek. "If you're hiring, the job is yours," she said softly, "for as long as you want it." And standing there under the vast, endless sky, on the land that had cost them both so much, they knew they were finally home. The past was a landscape of scars, but the future was something they would build together. Their story is a powerful reminder that even in the darkest of nights, the sun will eventually rise. It shows that who you were doesn't have to define who you are, and that sometimes the greatest treasures aren't buried in the ground, but are found in the courage of another human soul. What do you think? Was Abraham right to get involved in the first place, or should he have just ridden away? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story of survival, betrayal, and redemption, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.